Well, is everybody all right today? Well, I hope you had an interesting time trying to ferret out the concept of the image of God and the concept of sin, the concept of idolatry and so forth, because that gives you a good opportunity to seriously dig into something which perhaps we've just covered a little bit lightly. When you're doing a course like this in which the whole history of Christian ethics is kind of looked at just as a glance, one of the things you have to understand is that in Christianity, theology and ethics are not separate things. You can separate ethics from theology in almost every perspective. But in Judaism and Christianity, there is no way for theology and ethics to be separated, because what you do depends on who is your God. What you do is dependent upon what you believe. And that's the reason why ethics, Christian ethics, is so complicated, because it's not just a rationalistic attempt to find out what human capabilities and possibilities are. It's actually an attempt to discover what human beings were created for and what they are not adequately taking care of. In other words, Christian ethics and Jewish ethics are always beyond the grasp, so to speak, of human beings. And if they were not beyond the grasp, as somebody said, then what is a heaven for? In other words, Christian ethics are not only theological, they're eschatological. When we look back on the history of Christianity, it is not hard, and one of the jobs of a Christian teacher is to point out how miserably, quite often, Christians, particularly what we sometimes call the church, though sometimes we use that expression, certainly media use that expression in a way that does not reflect the meaning of church in Christian theology. But sometimes how miserable the church has been in being ethical or living up to the standards of Christianity. And it doesn't take a very well-versed historian to cite some of the instances. You know, we always hear about the Crusades, we hear about the Inquisition, we hear about the Holocaust, and we need to hear about those things because those are illustrations. This is what a lot of people don't understand. Those are illustrations of what Christian ethics, Christian theology mean by sin. They're not illustrations of what Christian theology means by morality or ethics. They're illustrations of what Christian theology means by sin. In other words, there is a transcendent criterion in Jewish and Christian theology to which Jews and Christians never completely measure up. But they can still look to that criterion to see how they do not measure up. That's what the Reformers and Augustine and Paul especially emphasized in looking at the law. Not that the law was good. The law is a criterion to which neither Jews or Christians or anyone else in the world can measure up, and that's the reason why Christian ethics must be an ethics of grace, an ethics of an eschatological ethic, which is looking forward to fulfillment. This whole thing relates to our subject for today, and that is the image of God. Quite often, people discuss the image of God in a very superficial way, and they discuss things like sin and even the concept of original sin in a very superficial way. One of the big, almost the public enemy number one in the history of the United States has been John Calvin. And that's because a lot of our intellectuals in the second, third, fourth generation after Calvin were Calvinists who were, in a sense, in rebellion against some of the extreme interpretations of Calvin. And so a lot of Americans, when they hear the word predestination or when they hear the word original sin, they just go wild. How in the world can a modern, rational person believe in original sin? I, for instance, was raised in a religious group that was descendant from the Puritans in certain ways, but in other ways it was very anti-Puritan. So our preachers in the church when I was raised used to preach sermons against John Calvin, and used to preach sermons against any concept of original sin. And if they understood the doctrine of original sin correctly, then I suppose these sermons were warranted. But what I've discovered in studying Reformation theology and studying Calvin and studying the Bible is that even though the expression original sin is not found in the Bible, all of the elements, all of the theological and spiritual elements of the idea of original sin are found in the Bible. But it's probably, as some theologians have suggested, it's probably more prudent for theologians not to use that word much anymore, because it has been so deprived of its original meaning and original intention that people just don't believe that intelligent theologians can even have a doctrine of original sin. Well, you need to go back and read, for instance, probably the most influential American theologian of the 20th century, who was Reinhold Niebuhr. And if you read Reinhold Niebuhr, you will be reading a great deal about the doctrine of original sin. He even said toward the end of his life that he may have made a mistake continuing to use that expression because it is so misunderstood. But Niebuhr is the theologian who had the most impact, for instance, on the Roosevelts, on John Kennedy, on Jimmy Carter, on Martin Luther King, and all of these people. They were his theologian. And so even though Martin Luther King, for instance, would probably not use the expression original sin very much, he certainly used the expression sin, and he certainly understood human nature in a more profound way because of his theological understanding of sin. He was able, for instance, to be more forgiving of people who are his enemies in the civil rights movement, because he understood that they were sinners, he was sinners, all of us are sinners in this whole thing, and that's basically what original sin means. Original sin does not mean that it happened a long time ago. That's not what original sin means. Original sin means that something went wrong. There was first original goodness. If you don't understand that, then there's no use talking about original sin. There was first original goodness. God did not create us to be sinners. Sin is not a creation of God. And so original sin does not refer to the first thing to be said about human beings. The first thing to be said about human beings is that human beings are made in the image of God. And only then do you talk about what has obscured the image of God, what has corrupted the image of God, what has perhaps even erased the image of God in some people. Because the image of God, as you've read, is not a substance which human beings are born with. It's not, for instance, the immortal soul of Plato. It's not even the brain or the rationality of Aristotle. You can be one of the most rational people in the world and be one of the most evil people. So just being very intelligent is not an expression of what the Bible means by being made in the image of God. We can name some very intelligent people whom we would not want to meet in a dark alley because they are not acting, at least, in terms of their being in the image of God. Now, the first thing people think of when they think of the image of God is a physical likeness, because that is the image of God in idolatry. That's the image of God in polytheism, in magical religion. That God is either made in the image of a human being or he's made in the image of an animal and so forth. In other words, when you run into an idol, even primitive people understood that idol wasn't God, but that idol was an image of God. And so that's the reason why very early in the writing of the Bible, Jews are forbidden even to make images, particularly to make images of human beings. And there were to be no images of human beings in the temple because of the very confusing way in which a human image undercuts human understanding of the nature of God and what it means to be made in the image of God. To be made in the image of God does not mean to look like God. Human beings physically look more like monkeys than God. Human beings, yeah, people don't like to hear this, but I mean, it's just the scientific fact. Human beings look more like chimpanzees than God. Their DNA is closer to chimpanzees than to God. In fact, their DNA doesn't have any contact with God. But it does have very close contact with monkeys and with all other things. So a human being doesn't look any more like God than a monkey does. In fact, a human being doesn't look any more like God than a slug does. That's not what the image of God means. Though if you listen to the way some modern people talk about God, you would think that he was a giant slug. You know, they just refuse to talk about God in any anthropomorphic, using any kind of anthropomorphic character, or even talk about God in terms of personality. Which means if God, now this doesn't prove one way or another whether there's a God, but if God is not at least personal, then any human being is a higher being than God, at least in spiritual terms. You can talk about God being super personal or supra-personal, but if you don't talk about God at least as being personal, then you're not in contact with the Jewish and Christian tradition. You've latched on to something else. As C.S. Lewis used to say, God is sometimes, sometimes people's conception of God is that he's a giant tapioca pudding, has no personality, has no capacity to love, capacity to relate to people. Well, there's where you get into the image of God. If you find a human being who has the capacity, who loves and who relates and who is obedient and faithful to God, and however way that's understood, and in the Christian perspective, it's understood in a pretty narrow way. But if you relate to God, if you relate to other human beings, particularly in love and forgiveness and so forth, that is the image of God. One of the founders or precursors of modern existentialism is Pascal, the French Roman Catholic theologian, a monastic, who talks in very stark terms about the nature of human beings. They're stark in the sense that if you take one half of his description of what a human being is, you come out with modern liberalism. If you take the other half of what he says about human beings, you come out with modern atheistic existentialism. And so what makes Pascal so important in the history of Christian theology, just like Augustine and Luther and Calvin, is that they hold these two aspects of human being together. The Christian religion teaches, Pascal says, teaches men these two truths. And if you don't have these two truths together, then you're not going to be able to understand Christian ethics. That there is a God whom men can know, and that there is a corruption in their nature which renders them unworthy of him. It is equally dangerous for man to know God without knowing his own wretchedness, and to know his own wretchedness without knowing the Redeemer who can free him from it. Now we, modern people, even modern Christians and Jews, don't like that language. We don't like the word wretchedness. We don't like the word corruption to be applied to human beings. I'm in situations all the time in which I'm not trying to convert anybody to any particular religious perspective, but I'll use the word sin. We are all sinners. And someone, sometimes very religious, will just react very negatively to that because they think that I'm saying that they are of no value whatsoever, that they are just rotten. And what we have to understand is that English, these are English words that used to mean something. And to say that human beings were wretched was not to say something religious necessarily about human beings. It was to say what you saw every time you walked out in the streets. Imagine living in Paris in the 18th century or in London in the 18th century and then walking out in the streets at night and seeing the wretchedness in human life. Imagine going to some cities in the United States sometimes during the day without seeing the wretchedness of human life. That's not a judgment on individual human beings. That's a judgment on the fact that human beings do things that land them in the newspapers in the morning. You understand? Human beings all over the world are doing things right now, which the best word to describe it is wretchedness. But we don't want to think of ourselves in that light. And so if the Serbians are doing it, we can think of it as wretchedness, but we can't think of the Serbians being the same kind of human beings as we are. Are they Albanians or anyone? If they're doing things like this, then we think somehow or another something has gone wrong with them. Well, the point of sin is that there is something gone wrong. It's something that's gone wrong with all human beings. And we have no basis for self-righteousness. We have a basis perhaps for helping to protect the innocent and trying to raise the moral tone of international relations and try to do something to fight human beings' inhumanity to other human beings. But we have to do that humbly because our ancestors did the same thing. I saw a program the other day on C-SPAN, and it was about a book written by the captain of the Mayflower. And they were doing the discussion of this book at the village that has been built up at Plymouth, Massachusetts. And one of my favorite preachers, whose name is Peter Gomes, who's the minister at Harvard University, preacher at Harvard Chapel, is a citizen of Plymouth. That's where he lives, and he's written a great deal on Puritans. And since he's kind of a liberal Episcopalian, a lot of people assume that he has a not very profound conception of sin and Calvinism and so forth, but he understands the profundity of these primitive people in their understanding of human nature. That doesn't mean that everything they thought about human beings is justifiable, but at least they understood human nature more than some of the subsequent Americans have, and so as a result, a lot of subsequent Americans have gotten into all kinds of trouble, being overly optimistic, almost utopian about what human beings can accomplish. And then every time we do that, we fall into some kind of mess. You know, something like Vietnam, something like the Serbian War, something like World War II, something like World War I, happens every generation. Yet after each one of these things, we hope that something like this is never going to happen again. But what happens? It happens again. It happens again. And it's going to continue to happen again. And one of the most dangerous things is to be overly optimistic or utopian about it and not being realistic about it. We have to understand it can happen here. And it can happen again. Because human beings in the United States are no different basically from human beings in Germany in 1935. They're not basically different from Serbians in 1998 or 1999. So it can happen here, depending upon the circumstances. We have that capacity. And so when Pascal says you have to understand two things about human beings, that is that they can know God, but they also need to know about the corruption that they face in their own natures. So it is equally dangerous for man to know God without knowing his own wretchedness. That's utopianism. That's kind of idealistic liberalism. There are all kinds of ways in which this expresses itself. That's, for instance, Marxism. Marxism doesn't particularly know God, but it also does not particularly know of its own wretchedness. It knows the wretchedness of the czars, and it knows the wretchedness of the enemies. It's just like the French Revolution. The French revolutionaries were for fraternity and liberty and so forth, and they knew who the real wretches were. It wasn't them. It was the people who had the money. It was the people in the aristocracy. It was the people in the royalty. So once you chop their heads off, everything's going to be fine. That's the difference between the French Revolution and the American Revolution. Even though the French Revolution occurred after the American Revolution, the French Revolution did not have a Puritan concept of sin. So it considered to be good guys. They considered that in this fight there were the good guys and the bad guys. And what you need to do is just chop off the heads of all the bad guys, and then all will be left is what? Good guys. America, fortunately, escaped that kind of political understanding of human nature because of the influence of Puritans. And Pascal is a Catholic Puritan. He's also a Catholic existentialist. But it's also equally dangerous to know our own wretchedness without knowing the Redeemer who can free him from it. A lot of Americans are, for instance, today reacting against what they call hellfire and damnation preaching. And a lot of hellfire and damnation preaching is